The Western United Methodist Church welcomes you to the third of 4 sessions focused on a piece of cloth called the Shroud of Turin, which is reputed to be the burial cloth of Jesus. In our first session, we looked at the burial practices and crucifixion practices of 2,000 years ago. We looked at medical information from the 24 medical examiners of the Shroud of Turin. And then for a lot of the first session and all of the second session, we looked at scientific findings associated with the shroud. So we're now at the point of moving to what happened to the shroud in the year 2002, and then we're going to move on to the historical materials. In 2002, the owner of the shroud, the Roman Catholic Church, decided that they needed to do something for the sake of conservation. The scientists had been talking about the question of would the image in time disappear? If it's because of corrosion of the fabric and everything starts to corrode, in time there would be no image difference between it and the background. So the decision was made sometime to first make the shroud forever flat instead of rolled up, put it in a new special case that was prepared, and have it within an inert gas for the rest of its time. And hopefully in this way, it would be conserved better than it would be otherwise. 30 patches were removed from the shroud that had been there since 1532 to kind of hold it together from the fire damage. And the backing cloth, which had been stitched to it at the same time, and it's been called the Holland cloth, was removed and then replaced with another Holland cloth. So if you looked at it today, this would be a better picture of what you would see than what we've been seeing up to this point. There was, of course, under those patches, a lot of debris. Things had crumpled because of the rolling action when they would put it away after the exhibitions. They did save all that material, mapped in such a way that it could be research material in the future. Whether that'll happen, I don't know. The custodian claimed that there was some damage that moved out into other fibers. And there's a great deal of controversy about that whole point. And the controversy will not end just with that point, because some other things happened as they did it. One of the things that impacts is that the dimensions changed. And we talked last time that the material that had been photographed in the eye was no longer seen the same way by cameras. Jesus of Nazareth, Shroud Man, if they're the same, grew by an inch when they made it out flat. So dimensions have changed as a result of detaching that old cloth, taking away the patches, and putting on a new cloth. A lot of the members of the science community were a great deal upset that the conservation work wasn't done with regard to science implications, and no special gloves, clothing, so forth, was taken into account when they did the conservation work. Nonetheless, it's been done, and today this is the way you would see it if you went to one of the exhibitions. When it was completely removed and they had a chance to do something they had not seen before, using special kinds of filters and everything else, they found that there is a faint face and a couple other body part image on the backside. Something they had not realized when they looked under it in the few looks they got in 1978. This was more recent. And so we have a little bit of information of nose, eyes, and so forth, but none of the shoulders, not the back, not as detailed remotely, and certainly not to the visible eye like you and I would have if we went to simply see it at an exhibition. It exactly corresponds to the other side. So from that point of view, it makes sense. On the other hand, it does cause a lot of concern about how to interpret in any hypothesis that science would want to put up, because now you're saying that you have the very faint image on one side of a thread and a very faint image on the other side of the thread with white in between. How does that happen? It doesn't make it a lot more difficult to imagine how this could be caused. So I gave you last time the best guess of hypothesis. I'm not going to change that because that's where it still stands. But the second image bothers a lot of folks that are trying to figure this out. Updated also in the early 2005, 2006 time was chiaroscuro. I think I've said that correctly. That has to do with art. Now, looking at this ball, you get a sense of roundedness and depth because of the shading. Or if you looked in this, you can see it in the same way. It was realized that there is an illusion of chiaroscuro on the shroud, which makes no sense, as you'll see from this statement. A most interesting aspect of the Shroud of Turin is the visual nature of the image, that there's an illusion of chiaroscuro, the use of light and shade independently of color to give a sense of dimensionality to the picture. For some, the Shroud of Turin's chiaroscuro is a powerful indication that the image is miraculous, even though science can't support that idea. The idea is all the more compelling because in reality we are very concerned that the image is not a true chiaroscuro. Chiaroscuro in art is an illusion. It's one of the many techniques that an artist uses to give a sense of dimensionality and depth to a picture. But computerized image analysis of the images on the Shroud of Turin indicates that what we perceive as the play of light in the images is not and cannot be light. The illusion is an illusion of an illusion, and that makes no sense.
Why did you say it?
You see the problem we struggle with all the more. This continues to get more complicated than as time goes by. Now, we do know with another object we've talked about that on the Virgin of Guadalupe, some issues arise about color there. And we also know that certain beetles and birds and butterflies have color shifts that we don't understand and we can't duplicate. All the more intriguing. It's just raised as an extra freebie for you at no extra charge. Just realize there are some things that each time we learn something, it doesn't necessarily make it easier to know something. It may make it more difficult to imagine what the answers are. In mid 2005-06, we got a publication about a lady who spent her entire life with textiles. And it is her opinion that the shroud has a weave technique only seen in one other cloth, one from Masada, dating from around the 1st century. So independently of carbon dating or something else, we have an opinion. It's not placed in writing signed by her yet, but at any rate, this has been added. Okay, that wraps up kind of a sense of update. Since around 2007, there's not been anything dramatically, that I can detect, dramatically changing in our understanding of the shroud. That doesn't mean that they stopped doing anything trying to figure out answers, but I can't think of any earth-shattering announcement to make or to include. So when we started, we said we were going to deal with an equation. Could Shroud Man be the same as Jesus of Nazareth? And then we said later we'd take the question, could Jesus of Nazareth be the same as the Christ that was predicted? So we've spent 2 nights looking at the question, from a scientific point of view. Could Shroud Man equal Jesus? Well, we're going to move to a second method now. And the evidential method is very important for us just as well. Science works with a whole lot of conditions, hypotheses, repeated trials. It measures error, it makes direct observation. But it can't really do a lot of the things you and I have to do every day. In general, science has no particular need of historical fact. It doesn't know what to do with them. If you ask the question, does Abraham Lincoln serve as our president? There's not any way to get there from a scientific point of view. We're into a different method. And it's been called a lot of things. I'm going to use evidential method, but it's been called the legal historical method, the legal histori, or something like that. It's had several different names. But the whole point is there's another method for getting at factual material. And that's what we want to use. When you're presented with oral testimony, or written testimony, or physical testimony, science can be involved in these. Example being, it could be asked to replicate what oral testimony claims. Or it could be asked to inspect the paper and the ink that written testimony appears in. Or it could be asked to inspect physical testimony, which is usually called evidence in a court. And the main reason why I raise that is to make sure we understand one key point as we go forward. You and I live our lives with a lot of stuff, a lot of facts that have nothing to do with science. But we still have to establish something, and we have to prove a point. And the evidential method is focused on that. Its nature is not that much different from a, shall we say, characteristic of science question. You still have to look for sources of bias. They don't ever call it amorality, but you've heard of impartial or blind justice. Same general idea. You have to be open to the same range of possibilities demanding evidence. You try to connect seemingly unrelated facts. They never talk about conditions, but denial that parts of the world are somehow involved in what you're trying to write as an historian is very much in evidence. They eliminate alternatives. They never talk about probability, but likelihood is a phrase that's used in the evidential method. Yes, you should be searching for contradictory evidence. You should be trying to verify it. You may not be replicating it, but you'd be trying to verify it. And yes, it would be a shared kind of thing with someone else. Multiple sources, reliable sources, likely sources, confirming against sources of contradiction, should any exist, fitting with other evidence, both the time and the other testimony. Do you have the opportunity, the motive, and the means? You often hear that with courts, to carry it out. Exhaustive research. These are the kinds of things that the evidential method tries to do, but it's not science. So, what we're after is, what is the probable Shroud history using the evidential method? We already did that once. When we started, we raised the question about the reliability of evidence, and we found an awful lot of material exists for this person called Jesus of Nazareth. So, original sources, reliability of sources, multiple sources, we've already touched on that in a different way. There are 5 references to Jesus in the Jewish Mishnah. It's the religious literature that was created around 200 AD, and it would be after the Jewish material that Christians would call the Old Testament. My point here is to realize that there are books about the material of Jesus outside the New Testament. It's not 1 or 2 references, there are several. And we'll touch on just a couple tonight. One example in the Mishnah is, it has been taught on the eve of Passover, they hanged Yeshua because he practiced sorcery and enticed and led Israel astray. So the question would arise with this: are you confirming things against where they probably would contradict it if it weren't true? 200 years after Jesus of Nazareth had his ministry, the people who might have been most inclined to say that didn't happen are saying something did happen. Not what the Christian Bible has in it, but definitely has something happen, and it has parallels with how Christians understand what happened historically. Josephus was a Jewish historian. Here's what he wrote. At about this time lived Jesus, a wise man. He performed astonishing feats and was a teacher of such people as are eager for novelties. He attracted many Jews and many of the Greeks. Upon an indictment brought by leading members of our society, Pilate sentenced him to the cross. But those who had loved him from the very first did not cease to be attached to him. The Brotherhood of the Christians, named after him, is still in existence. And if you think about what you're seeing there, you're seeing a lot of items that you would anticipate to be true if the man actually walked the earth and if the gospels written about him has some validity. So you'd be looking at likely sources. Does it fit with other materials? From 6 to 66 AD, some burial practices might be helpful for us to understand a little bit about the shroud. The Romans cremated their dead. The Egyptians disemboweled and pickled their dead. And the Hebrews used a shroud. Normally, the crucifixion victims were left on the crosses to be devoured by animals. And if anything was left, they'd be thrown on garbage heaps. The Hebrew people were a subservient government to Rome. But they made a deal that no dead people were going to be on crosses in their territory before the Sabbath. They were permitted for a limited period of time to bury their victims. Non-Jews placed coins in the mouth of the victims to pay the tariff across the river Styx after death. Hebrews, when the eyes wouldn't close, put coins on the eyes. The practice of allowing the burial of a Jewish crucifix victim then is limited between 6 and 66 when the Jews revolted. And one other related fact, Gamaliel, remember, was one of the major people in the Sanhedrin. He was buried with 80 pounds of spices when he died. And according to your scriptures, Jesus was buried with 100 pounds. The point I'm driving at with here, in one slide, I've tried to illustrate that a much-loved Jew condemned as a criminal near the time of Jesus somehow ends up in a shroud. Would tend to make you think, yeah, this is probably then a genuine sort of thing that we're looking at. Just from a fact point of view, without trying to replicate in all the things that a science approach might do. So you're fitting with other evidence, time frame, the opportunity, the motive. These are some of the issues, again, that a historian should take on. Well, in 1978, a man by the name Ian Wilson published his book, and that was what broke it wide open. Wilson had been trying to figure out, is there a history to the shroud? About the same time as the scientists were trying to figure out, is there any authenticity to the shroud? And we're going to take on our understanding a lot from what Ian proposes. To help us do it, I'm going to have 5 names that we're going to cover. Where you see this black line running down the side, it's going to be called the image of Edessa. Where you see the red line going down the side, the name Mandylion applies, and in this case, it's at the same time. There comes a point when there's a gap, and for lack of another phrase, I'm going to call it the head. You'll see why. Then when it becomes public in 1357, the name was the Leary Shroud. Then after some years, it became what we call it today, the Shroud of Turin. So 5 names are going to be applied to it in what we do. We're going to work our way through these panels trying to put some historical material into them to see the flow. Sometimes I'm going to jump a little bit because it's easier to discuss them rather than exactly perfectly in order. Sometime around 29 AD, we have the encoding of this piece of cloth. I put a question mark behind science proving that point, right? I told you because of the eye changing between the photography in the early years and 2002 photography, I've got to put question marks up there. I no longer have as much support for that position as before. The guess is around year 40, it begins to travel away from Jerusalem, north. Now, if you were to look in a dictionary that has to do with beliefs and understanding, you'll find the term Holy Saturday with there wasn't any special thing going on, blah, blah, blah. But there, in fact, is something that happens because in 616, at least by then, there is liturgy that says Peter ran to the tomb with John and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen one. How long it had been in use, who knows? But at least it's documented by 616. Some phrase like this. Who took the shroud? Well, there's more than one possibility. It could be Peter, it could be Pilate, Mary, John, Joseph of Arimathea. Case could be made for any of the one of them. Joseph of Arimathea, that was his tomb. He may have been the one who had this expensive piece of cloth as the shroud. Of course, Mary, that would make sense. You might have given it to the mother of the man that just died. John was taking care of Mary. Peter is a good possibility because you remember Peter ends up with the sudarium and wraps it around his head when he does anointings. You may be surprised about Pilate. Oh, you may not realize that Pilate is a saint in the Greek Orthodox Church and the Coptic Christian Church. And there are in the Apocrypha to the New Testament letters between Pilate and Herod and so forth. And so he actually has, shall we say, some respectability to some people. And you could certainly see how he might end up with it. If the guards decided it was in their best interest to explain how they let a dead man escape, they might want to take the cloth to show, look what we found. Who knows? That is a possibility. So you can make a case for any of them. Exactly where it went, that's a little hard to say. Around 70, of course, Jerusalem is destroyed. So obviously it had to be out of there by that point. The destruction was such that, you recall, they decided to level the place, right? No, a single stone was going to be left on top of another stone. That was the whole point. All right? This may have been the point at which it was hidden someplace in a jar. And the reason I show you the picture on the left is because that's what they did with what we later found to be all these documents that were hidden. And the water stains would fit that pattern that the shroud was simply put down in a jar, and the moisture would have gotten the edges just a little bit as we currently see it. It's an unknown, but it's one great possibility. We're now going to focus on Edessa, and I'm going to bring a couple different things here, as you can see coming down this chart. Several routes are possible out of Jerusalem. The destruction of Jerusalem in 70 meant you had to go someplace. The safest place would have been to go north, to get out of the Roman territory into territories of other empires. And Edessa is the first one to have some documentation with the Mandylion, or the image of Edessa names. Whether it made stops in between, well, Wilson thought there was a good chance it might have stopped there. It wouldn't necessarily have gone all the way to Edessa as its first stop. Now, you've heard maybe of Veronica's Veil, which in the Roman Catholic tradition is a station of the cross, or I think it's the 14th one. At any rate, you go through these stations of the cross, and there's one that talks about Veronica's Veil. It's quite possible that Veronica is a corruption of the word very icon. And we certainly know that Mandylion, one of its names, comes from the Arabic word for veil or handkerchief. So there's some possibility here as it traveled. It picked up some ideas. It picked up some tradition that may or may not have any value for us. It arrives in time in Edessa. And here's a damaged picture of King Abgar receiving a diptych. Now, a diptych is a two-sided hardcover device that has no pages. So at most it's going to have 4 images at most. And what he receives takes that form. The king is immediately healed. All right? His son reverts to pagan religion, and the item, whatever he received, was hidden. And it's going to be hidden for a long time. One of the later descendants finds a crown with a cross on it. In the flooring, they find images that seem to pick up on what you would expect from the shroud. Here's the letter. Again, we go back to the Apocrypha to the New Testament. The letter that Abgar sends to Jesus, and the answer that Jesus sends back to Abgar. Abgarus, king of Edessa, to Jesus, the good Savior, who appears at Jerusalem, greeting. I've been informed concerning you and your cures, which are performed without use of medicines and herbs. For it is reported that you cause the blind to see, the lame to walk, do both cleanse lepers and cast out unclean spirits and devils, and restores them to health who have been long diseased, and raised up the dead. All which, when I heard, I was persuaded of one of these two. Either you're the God himself, descended from heaven, who do these things, or the Son of God. On this account, therefore, I have wrote to you. Wrote is intentional. And earnestly to desire that you would take the trouble of a journey hither, and cure disease which I am under. For I hear that the Jews ridicule and intend you mischief. My city is indeed small, but neat and large enough for us both. I like that philosophy. More than one of us can be in one place. Chapter 2 of that particular thing is the answer back. Abgarus, you're happy, for as much as you have believed on me, whom you have not seen. For it is written concerning me that those who have seen me should not believe on me, that they who have not seen might believe and live. As to the part of your letter which relates to my giving you a visit, I must inform you that I must fulfill all the ends of my mission in this country, and after that be received up again to him who sent me. But after my ascension, I will send one of my disciples who will cure your disease and give life to you and all that are with you. Whoa. Now, do I think this was written near the time of Jesus? No, I can't convince myself of that. Do I think it's fully accurate as to what happened? No. Does it suggest maybe something happened? Well, let's look. There's a thing called a model roll. This particular thing that's been found is from the 6th to the 7th century. It's 2.5 inches wide, not very wide at all, but 11 feet long. And it's a series of text and pictures. And it was so prized, it was actually a legally inherited item. It portrays Abgar's messenger showing Jesus' face to a man on the street. And Ananias is the name of the person. But there's another tradition. This particular one comes from a 19th century painting in which St. Jude Thaddeus, called Adelaide, brings the item of Jesus' face to King Abgar and shows him, and he is cured. The Council of Nicaea II in 787 speaks of the image of Edessa as not being made with human hands, something that we're going to get used to hearing tonight, belonging to Christ and sent to King Abgar. So many, many years ago, somehow a church council was convinced something happened. Not made with human hands. We're going to hear it again. If you went to Edessa, you would find at the red thing I've circled, the place that it's going to be hidden for hundreds of years when it didn't fit in with the political appointments of the day. There's a site that shows where King Abgar and Thaddeus are buried, and there's a site, the blue circle, where the Mandylion was from 544 to 944 AD. But first we have to hide it, because you're going to have a son who doesn't want the thing around. So now we'll talk about Mandylion form, copies, and the lamentation. The Mandylion in Wilson's theory is that the shroud was folded and was displayed only as a face for almost 1,000 years. So something more like this would have been the way it was seen if it were seen for almost 1,000 years. Wilson proposed there had to be a certain folding method to make all this thing work out just right. Okay? Later knowing that the pollen of Edessa, this is the scientist now, the pollen of Edessa are almost totally at the face, which makes sense then it was a hidden object in some manner, but something over it at this point in its life. The historian, of course, had the hypothesis about the physical testimony. So he wanted the scientists, when they did their study, to see if he's right. And they were able to find, by golly, you find fold lines on that thing right where you said they were going to be. Isn't it neat when people can make a hypothesis form and someone else can work on it and try to figure out, does it seem to fit this? He said the trellis would explain then the halo thing that you may have wondered about in Christian art. Why do we have a halo that we keep putting over the head of Jesus? Where would that have come from? Well, this might explain it, that what they were seeing was face only with this circle on this trellis. So the historian is trying to help others in this cross-disciplinary issue. They said the hidden body would also explain one more thing. Why is the face a little bit brighter versus the rest of the body today? How come there's a difference in the quality of the light that we have? Okay? The Mandylion, of course, is an odd format. Maybe you've already picked up on that point. It is almost universal, and the universality in anthropology is fairly limited, but it's almost universal that we're going to have a portrait, as we call it, orientation, if a face is involved. This one isn't. It's a landscape. Doesn't make sense with what we really expect to find. Okay? I bring this slide back. Do you notice 6 lines coming out from the head on the diptych? What's the point of having 6 lines come out on the head? Could it be that it had at one point a halo added to it somehow, as we typically do it in our art, but the halo element got lost because of weathering and all the other things that happen? Okay. What about the trellis bases? Where would that design have come from? Well, the Parthian king was the next, shall we say, kingdom further up. If the shroud went into that, it was safer from the Romans. It would be safer from more of the Jewish people who might have reason to not want it to survive. But the trellis pattern could be picked up and added around this thing when it was being displayed. Why only the face? Well, prior to about 300 AD, the cross wasn't especially a strong image with Christians. It was a reminder of the horror. At that time, things like fish, Alpha and Omega, Cairo, and the iris flower were the images of Christianity. Now, before I leave this, I'll intrigue you maybe a little bit more by saying, I'm sure you've heard of the word parting shot. Yeah? Phrase you've maybe even used in your life. It didn't start out with that word. It started out as Parthian shot. It was the Parthian Empire that came up with a battle technique. When the armies faced off against each other, they could put their shields in a row and be very protected from things coming in like arrows. This was a good defense system. The Parthians came up with the idea that they would oppose them, and then they acted like they were going to run. And they all turned to run, and so the offender would put the shield out this way and run toward them, and then they turned and fired against them. And all the shields were turned at 90 degrees. Parthian shot. Aha! But we have it in our language as parting shot. Interesting how history ties things together. The pattern that you see here on 1190 painting, not much to say about it especially, but an account of 945 talks about the Mandelion in its golden casket and copies being sent out. And it says they're around even to the present day. Of course, that was 945. There's still these copies out there. There's a painting from 1164, and probably we are seeing some evidence in the cloth here around the body of that trellis pattern. Moving then to the image being finally refound, and what happens after that will be our next thing. Up to 550 AD, Jesus was portrayed, I like to think of shepherd image, the boy image, the young man image. These two are nice examples of it that I can get for you. After 550, it all changed. Something happened in 550 that artists had a new model to work with. In 544, they have an image, a painting, of people finding, quote, an item not made with human hands. You see that phrase again? Above the city gate that year. All right? So what's the background? Well, there's a group of people who theologically thought monophysites was the correct answer. They thought that Jesus had one nature. He was divine. And that you and I might think we see him, but we really didn't see him. It was an illusion of what we're seeing. So their view was Jesus didn't say die on the cross. He just kind of looked like he died on the cross because God couldn't be nailed to a cross and God couldn't die. Well, they found this item over the city gate in 525 AD. They didn't speak up for a long time because this is theologically counter to what they were trying to say. This looked like someone died in this thing, okay? Suddenly then, all the artwork takes on things that we would detect as being with the shroud. where the image is consistently in a certain mold and it has nothing to do with that young image that we looked at before. The minimum typically is 15 different points on an art picture that you see of Jesus of Nazareth. Number 12 in it is about the beard and the separation that's slightly off center. Number 13 is the lines that will be somehow crossing over the throat in the picture. The full number is usually considered 31 points, and there's the idea that could be over 100 points if you looked at everything. But here you see an example of the owlish eyes that we talked about because it was not positive, negative, that issue. You can see how the owlish eyes are there. But you can see how slightly off-center the beard is. You can see the two hairs that are tucked a certain way. And you see the little U shape between the eyes. You see the line coming somehow across the neck. These were the standard kinds of things that all the artwork took on. Other pictures, like this one, drop the owlish eyes. But again, you tend to see the various marks, the drop, the two threads over the eye or over the forehead on this particular picture. You see long, long fingers, and there's a reason for that. Now, the point I'm trying to drive at is art takes the shroud, seemingly thereafter, as the model to follow, and the artists are looking at it and trying to interpret, now, how do we put that as a picture? We talked about that also last time, so I'm going to add it at this point. Science had some things. Science also talked about the Solidus coins and whether they were modeled after the shroud. So we're going to move to now 3 texts. The first text has to do with the image of Edessa being described as being like a himation, a full-length outer garment worn by the Greeks. In the 10th century, we have the image of Edessa described as a peplos, which is a full-size robe. Between those two, you have a pope referring to the Mandylion for the very same mediator between God and men, that he might in every way satisfy the king, Abgar, stretched his whole body on a cloth, white as snow, on which the glorious image of the Lord's face and the length of his whole body was so divinely transformed that it was sufficient for those who could not see the Lord in the flesh to see the transfiguration made on the cloth. These then are textual materials that happen over the years too. We'll now move then from Edessa to Constantinople. The shroud moves. And it's a funny story because you have Edessa, and Edessa wants to keep the shroud. The reason they found it, the reason the Monophysites spoke up and said, there's something over the wall that you might want to get down, was that Edessa was under attack. They decided that maybe this shroud thing had protective power. So they said, get it out. They got it out, and they credited it with protecting the city of Edessa. That's when they started to keep the thing then visible publicly. Constantinople was impressed with this. So Constantinople makes a deal, and where they are coming after it and put a siege on Edessa strictly to get the shroud. And here was the deal. Edessa would be spared, 200 high-ranking Muslim prisoners would be released, 12,000 silver crowns would be paid to the victim, if you will. Edessa would have perpetual immunity from attack, and all they wanted back was the Mandylion and the 2 copies they knew they had in the city. They held out for a long time. The guy who was in charge of Edessa even contacted superiors in his empire before it was finally agreed, you can give it up for this kind of a deal. Consequently then, the shroud is brought to Constantinople. And we have 6 places we know it went in that particular town. And the very first thing they did was to march it slowly along all the walls, all the way around this thing, for its protective value. That was the whole point in getting it. But they did more with it than Edessa did, because they turned it into something that got involved in church services. They started something where they would have a Friday service with this shroud rising up out of a box at certain parts in the service. Rather intriguing idea. And so there's description by 2 different guys at different times about seeing this thing moving as part of their religious activity. He stood up on Good Friday services. This was proposed by Wilson in his book as requiring a lift method. And so he proposed this to the researchers during the 1978 work. And they were able to then look for his hypothesis and confirm, yes, there are lines showing right there, as you would expect each one of them to be, to make it fit around this device you're proposing that would lift it up and put it back when they were having their services. Isn't it neat how, again, we can get cooperation among branches of science and also history? We know it today, of course, as the Man of Sorrows in the Western Church. If you were in the more Eastern Orthodox areas, you would call it the King of Glory. And the image you see over here has been taken in many different places. If you went to a Greek Orthodox church, and if you would go to the front, all the way to the gate, as far as you're permitted to go, unless you're clergy, you can't go in to this back area. But if you then look to the right, this is what you would see as a picture in every one of the Greek Orthodox churches. And what it is that raised up position. All right. Let's move from there then to an ivory carving, and a mandilion equals the shroud text. We're up to 1100 now. This is one of the carvings that's pointed to with the trellis pattern on it. And then in 1130, we had a monk write a history of the church. And he calls the mandilion the shroud of Christ. And so we have in Europe, 227 years before the shroud is known, at Leary, we have text claiming it's the shroud of Christ. My conclusion as a person is that with this kind of liturgy, sermon, historical text, the sudarium, the vanillin test, and the other things we could point to, the carbon dating can't possibly be right. Independently of all the issues about the person maybe cutting the wrong thing and them taking it off camera and so forth and so on. And I would take the next step that if there's any date earlier than 616, as far as I'm concerned, throw it out. I taught anthropology as one of the subjects I taught in college. And if you had anything like this in anthropology, you would trash it. You would say, okay, it's not going to work for this particular item that we're trying to do. It doesn't fit the other evidence you've got. Okay. Let's move on to the Hungarian prayer manual. The oldest document in the Hungarian language is a prayer manual of 1194. And 2 scenes are shown on the cover. On the top scene, you had the Friday scene. And in this, you see them doing, in effect, an anointing for burial. The Sunday scene is showing them coming with something in their hand, maybe again for an anointing of sort. But all they have down here is the cloth. Now, for you and me, that doesn't maybe have any great excitement, but for the Shroud people it does, because if you look at the detail of it, there's a pattern of holes showing on that material. Over the years, we've called these the poker holes. It would appear that at some point in its history, someone had to test the shroud. You might call him the first scientist. Remember what you've got. You've got a piece of cloth that as you get close to it, you can't see anything, but you back up to 6 or 7 feet and you see something emerging. And so what they think happened was that someone tested it with a poker, tried to see if there was something in it at some point in its history. Now the holes from the 1532 fire damage are in straight lines, but we're talking about these L-shaped ones, and they appear on the Hungarian manual back in 1194. Not only are they poker potential, but because you have multiple layers where apparently the poker was poked in, at each level it gets smaller, suggestive that it was stacked up, and it, with a pointed kind of device of a poker, it didn't burn quite as big a thing as you move down through the layers. All right, we're now to Constantinople and its troubles. Constantinople has this shroud, and they are in trouble with the Muslims coming to attack them. They are concerned, and they put out an appeal to come and defend the linens found in the tomb after his resurrection. What they got is not exactly what they wanted. They got the Fourth Crusade sent to them. And the Crusaders arrive in town and are not paid. Uh-oh. And they see all the wealth of Constantinople in many, many different forms. And they get apparently very jealous and very upset. And finally, they sack the place. They take all kinds of materials away. And a foot soldier writes in 1204, no one knows where the shroud is after that point. It disappears. Well, there may be some ideas as to what happened. The Holy Grail legend begins. Something new. Two scenes of a picture that came from a later point, but will maybe help make it a little clear. You have on the right side two angels, one with a cloth and a candle, and the other with a spear that's bloodied. And then on the left part, you have a table with a lot of people around it. You can see a figure in a cup in the center of the cloth. Now, the Grail legend had many forms over the years, and of course became more and more elaborate, did lots of things. We want to only look at the first when it started. But for our purpose, trellis and grail are essentially the same word. You had people who were genealogists working on this question, as well as historians working on the same issue, trying to figure out what are the relationship among the words in these early documents that explained the Holy Grail concept. And here it comes. In its earliest version, before 1212, you have two maidens come into the chapel, one with a grail and the other with a bloody holy lance. They come into a room where a knight is eating. And there's a sweet odor filling the room. And he looks at the grail and he sees a radiance in it. The word radiance could be a candle. Next, the maidens appear with a child in the grail. That's what you saw in this picture. Then the maidens appear with the man being killed by a crucifixion and a spear. All right? This matches the sequence of a special all-day worship service in Good Friday held in Constantinople. Did it take a form after that that went, oh yeah, it went a lot of different directions all over Europe as they sang this song and did their thing with it again. But there was a group that this had a special appeal to. It wasn't just this element of it which applied on that time. They had, in the Knights Templars that we're going to see next, they had the idea that if a knight did frequently good things, they got to see more of the radiance in the Grail. Now, who were the knights? The Knights Templars, the group on the left, were a very fierce group of warriors. They started out originally as a small number to protect people coming to Jerusalem. They became the bankers of Europe before it was all over. They had a special niche at their castle for something that they worshipped very intently, but we don't know what it was. Wilson's theory is that it was the Shroud, and it was taken from Constantinople down to their special castle and its niche. But more recent material suggested, no, there's probably one other step in there that happened. There was a Princess Mary Margaret who had a wedding. She and her husband go to Hungary to set up the kingdom that they're going to be over. But unfortunately, when she gets there, things are going to happen that she hadn't quite planned on. The one she planned for was a church called Good Friday and not made with human hands. An interesting name for a church, but a name we've already seen a couple of times, haven't we? Okay. Well, Genghis Khan and the Asiatic horde came over the mountains and attacked Hungary. And they got to the point that the only thing they really had of value were the crown jewels. They ended up, not long after, having their crown jewels and all the money they ever wanted. And they got it from the Knights Templars, who were the bankers who didn't make loans. They gave out money if they had something in their hands from you that was worth something. They had all the money they could possibly want. And so the alternate theory is, this is when the Knights got the Shroud and took it. I know I'm making you struggle points. Well, we'll struggle and take a break at this point. Then we're going to find out what they did with it. Okay? Good time to break. So we have the possibility, let's see where, that it was taken now to Acre, to the site where they had their special handling. Then from that point, when they, as a result of the Crusades being systematically lost, the Knights Templars were forced to pull back to Europe. At that point, the Shroud would have been taken to the Paris area and eventually begin where we know it to have been by our documentation today. So let's move down then to the Templars worshiping a head. The Templars were so fierce as protectors, fighters, and everything else, they eventually reached the point they reported only to the Pope. Woo, talk about privilege. Well, this was bothersome to the King of France, who wanted to control his environment so much that he ends up getting the papacy moved to France. That year was 1309. He had already made a move slightly before that. He had 15,000 Knight Templars put in chains on Friday the 13th in 1307. They were tortured for 7 years trying to get various kinds of confessions out of them. Basically, the only thing they got was that they worshipped a head. Now, the Templars had a priest, a very well-respected priest today in our understanding of theology and everything else, Bernard de Clairvaux, who made the Pope tremble. So we're not talking about a minor priest. We're talking about one who, he had the presence to do what he wanted to do. He reported that he was not needed in the opinion of the Knights Templars when they did worship. Now his job was to invoke Christ's presence. And the Templars said, we already have it with the presence of the head. What could that be? Well, among the people that eventually was burned at the stake, there is a Geoffrey de Charny, whose name is going to appear to us a little bit later. It takes a while, but we're going to see that name appear when not the first one, but a survivor of his family has the same name. The one who was a Templar would not have married. He would have remained a bachelor. But the shroud appears publicly as we know the history of it by typical Western civilization now, in it one with a slightly different spelling, but almost the exact same name. I don't know how many of you have ever done genealogy research. My name is Kerr, a pretty short word, right? In doing it for my family, I found 36 spellings of Kerr. You wouldn't think you could get that many spellings of Kerr, but you can. And so this slight variation may be an immaterial point. But anyway, it's pretty darn close to the name. But this is a knight who's going to later be involved in the display. One of the 4 locations named as to where the head was in England. And in 1945, they finally found a hidden panel. And behind it was this image. Now, it's very similar to Eastern Orthodox Mandylion copies. Maybe it doesn't strike you as being shroud-like, but they believe it has 125 points of congruence with the shroud, and in a U.S. court, that's far more than you need to prove your point. So now we get to the point it's being called the Leary Shroud. The first exhibition of it occurred 1350, 51, 50, somewhere. 57 is the one that really is known. But we know it had to be before that because somehow it got to Leary. It was left in the hands of a knight who was an exemplary knight. How exemplary was this guy? Well, the French book of exemplary knights includes this particular, the English book contains this Frenchman as the cover. So he must have been fairly outstanding. He soon died. His widow is the one who got the church established that did the first display that we can document thoroughly in 1357. The reason we're sure it happened earlier is that there is a medallion that was found in Paris in the river. By heraldry law, you can't use a man's shield after he dies. And in this, you have his shield as well as the coat of arms of the other family. And down the center, you have the shroud being shown on this thing. So apparently there was a display, maybe early 50s, something like that. But 1357 would be the one absolutely documented in every way. So if we're trying to understand up to this point, how do we have so much trouble with the history of the shroud and knowledge of the thing? Well, it was mainly shown as a face. That makes it difficult to understand it as being a full-length garment. It arrives from a secret source in Europe in 1357 or 50 or somewhere right through there. Apparently no one would want to talk about where it came from. Knights Templars, all having been put in chains on the same day. I could see why you'd want to be real quiet if you happen to be the conduit that brought it into Europe. In 1902, two men decided that the Roman Catholic Church had too much stuff to do with relics. One was a seminary professor and another was a Roman Catholic laity. They composed a memo that said that a bishop, way back when, knew who faked this thing. And for 98 years, Shroud Studies have struggled with this particular memo. Well, of course, now we know there wasn't such a memo, but it took a long time to prove the point. Macron, in 1976, caused a major problem when he didn't follow the characteristics of science and realized that scattered iron oxide would probably be occurring on a cloth like this. Carbon dating, of course, we've learned from our study, was an unsuitable sample, so that threw things off. People who write books selectively ignore, remember that long list we keep putting together? Ignore those elements and instead establish things, shall we say, that have no scientific backing. And oddly enough, most speeches on the Shroud are done by people who do a very limited amount of work in their own right. So if you had Dr. Jackson, who's a very well-respected person, come here and talk to you, he's undoubtedly going to talk about what he does and what the Colorado Shroud of Turin Center does. And you would expect him to. You'd probably be upset if he didn't. But it also means he's selective, and probably most audiences probably need a broader scope. So oddly enough, someone who's a reader and doesn't have a particular research point to focus on does you as a laity more good than having a specialist in a particular area. Until you get kind of your feet wet in it, it doesn't help you a whole lot figuring out the whole ramification of all the parts. Well, keeping on going with our history, after the point that it had its first display that we know of and document and all that sort of thing in 1357, we know exactly where the Shroud went from time to time, including going into hiding in World War II to be sure the thing wasn't destroyed. Most intriguing to me, only two people knew where it was. Boy, if you had both of them killed at the same time, it would have been unfortunate. But it's had an interesting history since that point as it moved around. One of the locations it was put, they had a fire, the 1352 fire. That's got all the damage that we've talked about and all the patches and everything that happened. Would you believe that the Ivan the Terrible had a battle standard in which he picks up on the Shroud image? How about that the Soviet Army in World War II used it for their battle? I kept telling you it's about power, not about religion in some areas. Oh. Another fire came along, almost got it. Third fire comes along, it almost gets it, and they come rushing out with this thing in 1997. So, what I'm trying to establish for you is a sense here that we can add evidential method, especially from Wilson. The hypothesis of the Shroud doubling in 4 covered the Mendelian form, accounts for where the Shroud was prior to it being known publicly. Stirp, that group of scientists, were able to confirm those folds exactly in place where he would have it. Church historian says it was the Mendelian and the Shroud at the same time. It looks like the Knights Templars held the Shroud, but it was mainly known after the Descharnay family obtained it, and they wouldn't want to talk about where it came from. The physical witness from it finding the panel that was hidden confirms the issues of the Mendelian as a Knights Templar item of worship as a head. Currier-Briggs worked with genealogy, trying to figure out the complex blood and marriage linkages across Europe that had to do with people connected with the Shroud. The history of 945 talks about the copies coming in the golden casket at that time. It ended up in silver in the Shroud of Turin that we know. 2 descriptions by popes and so forth talk about the full-length nature of it. So I can give you a conclusion of my own. You don't have to take it. That the existence of the shroud is fairly well documented in history. Obviously, we don't have a lot of details at certain points that we'd love to have. It may be such that more will become sorted out in time. But it looks like enough things back through the 2,000 years can show it. Jerusalem, Edessa, working its way Constantinople, eventually around then to Paris, where it gets documented as we understand prime documentation today. So if we continue using the evidential method, which is what we use as Bible scholars, we're saying that Jesus began a ministry about age 30, spent about 3 years on that. One gospel doesn't fit that, more like, isn't it 15 months, something like that? One gospel, but the others seem to be more like 3 years. And so if we're trying to understand how we piece it together, if the coins on the eyes were valid, then it would be saying on Friday, March 16th, 29 AD, between 3 and 4 p.m., someone gathered 28 flowers which were placed in the shroud by 5:30. Between 3 p.m. Saturday and 4 a.m. on Sunday, the shroud was encoded with the image, with the blood, the wilting flowers around it. The encoding and removal process seems to fit only with something being out of every understanding that we are able to piece together. Now, that's saying the eyes being valid. I told you last time we had the problem since it was changed, different backing, stretched, actually twisted. 4 inches, centimeter longer on one side, 8 centimeters longer on the other side. It's a slight twist. So it's quite possible that you'd have to strike some things and say in Friday in a March or April, whatever, and maybe using evidential method, you could say it was 29 AD if our calendar is off by, say, 4 years. See how this is kind of put together? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. Have a blessed night. Tomorrow night, we'll take up the third method in our final session. Good night.
Thank you.